Ethan Miller returned to his inherited forest only to find 20 brand new cabins erected on his land, without a word of permission. Margaret Hensley, the polished and ruthless HOA president, had boldly claimed control, showing no respect for his family's legacy. But when Ethan uncovered long-forgotten deeds and zoning records, he turned the tide with undeniable proof in court. Just wait to see how he reclaimed what was rightfully his and how justice finally prevailed in this unforgettable showdown. Ethan Miller had always pictured the land his grandfather left him as a sanctuary, a quiet stretch of forest where sunlight filtered through touring pines and the air smelled of earth and pine needles. It wasn't much, just over 20 acres, but it was rich with family history, a place where he had spent countless summers fishing in the small creek, building forts with his cousins and listening to his grandfather tell stories by the fire. This land was more than property. It was a living memory, a piece of his family he could hold on to after his grandfather passed. That afternoon, Ethan was driving back from a meeting in the neighboring town, lost in thought, imagining plans to restore the old cabin and perhaps open a small retreat for writers and nature enthusiasts. He turned onto the winding road leading to his land, expecting the familiar hush of the forest, the way the sunlight hit the canopy in irregular patterns, and the distant murmur of the creek. Instead, he hit the brakes so hard his hands shook on the steering wheel. Before him stood 20 cabins, lined up like a small army of new developments, their walls gleaming unnaturally in the afternoon sun. Paved roads cut straight through the forest, curving neatly around the structures, and a small clubhouse sat at the center, complete with a sign reading, "Welcome to Willow Creek HOA Community." He blinked, thinking maybe he had misread the road or perhaps someone had been renovating the old cabins. But no, this was new. Everything was new. Shock rooted him to the spot. The sight was surreal, like stepping into an alternate reality where the land he cherished had been claimed by strangers. His mind raced, trying to reconcile the images with the memory of the untouched woods he had last visited just weeks ago. He stepped out of his truck, heart hammering, and walked along the edge of the road, running his fingers over the smooth asphalt. The cabins were flawless, almost too perfect, their uniformity mocking him. Every detail screamed planning and intent. The HOA had not just built, they had conquered. Anger began to swell in Ethan's chest, growing hotter with every step. How could the Willow Creek HOA have the audacity to encroach on his property without so much as a conversation, without a warning, without a single letter, notice, or invitation to discuss plans? It felt like a betrayal not just of him, but of everything his grandfather had worked for, everything his family had believed about respect and fairness. The sense of injustice was sharp, immediate, and inescapable. Ethan's gaze moved from one cabin to the next. Each structure seemed to mock his memory of the land, erasing years of quiet and history with every clean line of paint and every neatly planted shrub. He could almost hear his grandfather's voice echoing from the past, asking, "Who would dare?" The anger that surged was not just at the physical structures. It was at the principle of the act, the blatant disregard for his rights, the total disrespect for the family legacy he had inherited. He took a deep breath, trying to control the trembling in his hands, but it only fueled the fire inside him. The audacity of the HOA, the casual assumption that they could claim someone else's land, was infuriating. Ethan could feel it in his chest, a tight, burning knot of indignation. He remembered the meetings, the promises of community stewardship, the assurances that the town cared about fairness. And here it was crumbling before him in a display of brazen greed. Ethan stood at the edge of the property, fists clenched, eyes scanning the cabins and the clubhouse, trying to find a single crack in their perfect execution, a flaw he could exploit. But there was nothing, only a stark, unyielding statement. They had taken over. The forest he had loved, the creek he had fished in, the trails he had walked since childhood. This was not just land, it was a symbol of his family's legacy, and it had been stolen. That day, Ethan Miller felt a fire ignite inside him. One that would not be quenched by frustration or disbelief. The shock had passed. Now there was only anger, pure and driving. The Willow Creek HOA had underestimated him, and he would make sure they understood the cost of such arrogance. As he climbed back into his truck, his mind was already working, plotting, imagining a way to reclaim what was rightfully his. Anger had taken root, sharp and unrelenting, and it would not let go until justice had been served. Ethan Miller thought perhaps the anger he had felt that afternoon would fade with time, that the initial shock of seeing the cabins might settle into something manageable. He had never been a man to act rashly. He believed in dialogue and finding common ground. So after the fire of outrage cooled just enough to think clearly, he began his efforts to resolve the situation through reason. First, he visited the HOA office, a small, impeccably maintained building with polished floors and glass walls. He requested a meeting, explaining politely that the land in question was his inheritance. Margaret Hensley, the HOA president, welcomed him with a smile that was warm in appearance but sharp in undertone. Her hair was perfectly styled, her blazer crisply tailored, and every word she spoke was measured, almost rehearsed. She told him they had every right to develop the property, citing zoning regulations and alleged permissions. The words hit Ethan like a cold slap. Rights, permissions, all without even a single conversation with him. Undeterred, Ethan wrote emails, each one carefully detailing his ownership and the historical significance of the land to his family. He sent certified letters, tried phone calls, and even suggested a town meeting to discuss the matter publicly. Every effort was met with the same polite dismissal. Emails went unanswered, calls were redirected, and meetings were postponed under flimsy excuses. With every rebuff, the pain deepened. It wasn't just frustration, it was a gnawing sense of betrayal. The place that had been sacred to his family was being erased, and no one seemed willing to acknowledge it. Worse, Ethan began noticing how some neighbors reacted. What he had once thought was a supportive community now seemed indifferent, even complicit. Some greeted him with sympathetic nods but quickly followed with phrases like, "It's progress," or "Development is good for the town." They saw the cabins as a benefit, a step toward prosperity, while for Ethan, each structure was a wound. Every paved path and every freshly planted shrub felt like a deliberate erasure of memories, of summers spent under the dappled sunlight of his grandfather's trees. The community he had trusted appeared to have turned its back on him, and that realization sank him into a deeper, more personal sorrow. At home, Ethan could not escape the land from his thoughts. Nights became restless, filled with visions of the cabins standing where his grandfather once fished, where Ethan himself had learned to climb trees and build makeshift forts. He imagined the concrete foundations crushing wildflowers, the sounds of construction drowning out the songbirds. The laughter of children from his memories replaced by strangers' voices and the hum of machinery. Sleep offered no refuge. Each night brought renewed anxiety and the painful awareness that the place he loved was slipping further from his hands. Even during the day, he felt the weight of helplessness pressing down. Tasks that once seemed routine, checking emails, attending work meetings, answering phone calls, were now overshadowed by the constant mental replay of what had been taken from him. The injustice was not abstract, it was tangible, living in the trees, the soil, the very paths that had once been his sanctuary. He wrestled with anger that had once energized him, now curdled into a more insidious pain, one that seemed to permeate every quiet moment. Ethan's sense of betrayal extended beyond the HOA. His own trust in neighbors, in the idea of community, even in the assumption that rights would be respected, had been shaken. Each polite dismissal from Margaret Hensley and her board felt like a personal verdict against him. A judgment that his memories, his family history, and his rights were secondary to convenience and ambition. Pain settled over him like a fog, thick and unrelenting, and he realized that before he could fight back, he had to confront the emotional weight of what had been taken. Yet even in this haze of disappointment and sorrow, a quiet determination began to stir. Ethan's anguish, while consuming, was not paralyzing. Somewhere beneath the pain, beneath the sleepless nights and the relentless thoughts of stolen legacy, there remained a spark. He could feel it faintly, an ember of resolve, fragile but alive. He did not yet know how he would reclaim his land, but he knew in that aching, restless state that he could not let this injustice stand. Ethan Miller sat in the dim light of his living room, staring at the photographs of his grandfather smiling near the creek, and felt a painful mixture of grief and resolve. The cabins had changed everything, but they had not yet broken him. The fight was far from over, and somewhere deep inside he understood that enduring this pain was only the first step toward reclaiming what was rightfully his. Ethan Miller had spent weeks feeling trapped in a haze of frustration and helplessness, each day blurring into the next with the weight of the cabins looming over his memories. But one late evening, As the sun dipped low behind the trees and the room was bathed in a warm amber glow, he decided to tackle the mountain of family papers that had sat neglected in a dusty corner of his attic. He had avoided them for years, assuming they were merely sentimental keepsakes, but in that moment a quiet voice inside him urged, "There's something here you've overlooked." The attic smelled of old wood and faded ink, the air thick with the history of generations. Ethan spread the papers across a rickety table, stacking bundles of yellowed letters, faded photographs, and brittle envelopes. Hours passed as he methodically sifted through each item, the dim lamplight flickering over his determined expression. At first he found only echoes of the past, handwritten notes from his grandfather, birth certificates, and clippings from local newspapers. Each piece was a memory, but none offered the leverage he so desperately needed. Then, tucked beneath a folder labeled Deeds and Boundaries, he found something extraordinary. It was a series of meticulously kept property deeds, legal descriptions of the land, and historical zoning records that dated back decades. One document in particular caught his eye, a long-forgotten clause granting him full ownership and, most importantly, explicit veto power over any development on the property. Ethan's pulse quickened. His hands shook as he read and reread the lines, making sure he wasn't imagining the words that seemed to glow on the fragile paper. This wasn't just a technicality, it was a safeguard, a legal affirmation that the land could not be altered without his consent. For the first time in weeks, a spark of hope ignited inside him. The weight of despair that had been pressing down on him began to lift. Replaced by a sense of possibility, he realized that the power to fight back had been in his hands all along. He just needed to assemble the pieces and act. Determined, Ethan gathered every relevant document: deeds, old property maps, receipts for taxes paid over the years, and photographs marking the boundaries of the forest. Each piece of evidence became a building block for the case he would construct, a framework to reclaim the land that had been stolen from him. But even armed with this knowledge, Ethan understood he could not navigate the legal complexities alone. He needed someone sharp, meticulous, and fearless. Someone who could see the significance of every clause and argue effectively in court. That's when he reached out to Jessica Torres, a lawyer known for her tenacity and strategic mind. Jessica listened attentively as Ethan laid out the situation, her eyes narrowing in focus as she examined the documents. Within minutes, she began formulating a plan, highlighting points of leverage and identifying potential weaknesses in the HOA's position. Together, Ethan and Jessica worked late into the nights, reviewing each deed, each map, and every scrap of historical record. They cross-referenced zoning laws, consulted town records, and photographed the land itself, capturing angles that clearly demonstrated the boundaries and untouched areas of the forest. Ethan's initial despair gradually transformed into quiet determination. Every discovery, every verified document reinforced the truth he had been denied for so long. This land was his unequivocally, and the HOA's encroachment was unlawful. The sense of hope grew stronger with every passing day. Ethan began to visualize the confrontation to come, picturing the courtroom where justice would finally be served. No longer did he feel the crushing weight of powerlessness. Instead, he felt a steady, surging confidence. The fire that anger had ignited weeks earlier now had a purpose. It was no longer aimless rage, it was fueled by knowledge, evidence, and strategy. As the final document was filed and the presentation prepared, Ethan felt a profound shift within himself. Hope had taken root not as wishful thinking, but as actionable resolve. He knew the road ahead would still be challenging, that the HOA might resist every step, but for the first time since discovering the cabins, he truly believed victory was possible. The land his grandfather had cherished, the place filled with memories and stories, was not lost. It was waiting for him to reclaim it. And Ethan Miller was ready. The day of the hearing arrived with a sky so clear it seemed to reflect the tension humming through Willow Creek. Ethan Miller stood outside the small town courthouse, adjusting his tie with hands that were both steady and charged with anticipation. The familiar weight of hope mingled with lingering anxiety, a mixture that had kept him awake for countless nights, but now felt focused, purposeful. Today was the culmination of weeks of preparation, nights of research and days of quiet determination. Today justice would finally be measured. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick with the faint scent of polished wood and ink, the low murmur of townspeople filling the space until the judge entered and all conversation ceased. Ethan's eyes met Margaret Hensley's across the room. She wore her usual composed expression, hair perfectly styled, posture rigid, as if the act of standing in the courtroom could assert control over the situation. Yet beneath the calm exterior, Ethan could sense a flicker of unease. The meticulous preparation, the mountain of evidence he carried had already begun to unsettle her. Jessica Torres, ever composed, leaned close and whispered last-minute encouragement. "We've covered everything. Stick to the facts. Show them what's indisputable." Ethan nodded, drawing a slow breath, feeling the gravity of the moment settle over him. He stepped forward when the judge called his case, laying out the evidence systematically, methodically, and without hesitation. One by one, he presented the deeds, pointing out the clauses that granted him full ownership and veto power over any development. He displayed the historical records that traced the land's boundaries over decades, showing continuity of ownership, and he projected photographs marking the untouched areas of forest and creek. Each exhibit told a story of the land's true history, a story ignored by the HOA. When he finally revealed the original zoning maps, highlighting the inconsistencies between the HOA's construction and the town's legal framework, the room fell into an almost reverent silence. Margaret Hensley attempted to respond, her voice measured, her tone rehearsed, but the effect was diminished by the sheer clarity and weight of Ethan's documentation. Every claim she made, every assertion of rights or permission was met with factual counterpoints he had painstakingly gathered. As he spoke, Ethan felt a strange calm settle over him. The anger and pain that had fueled him weeks ago were now transformed into controlled determination. This was not just a fight over land. This was a testament to truth, diligence, and the principle that rights cannot be overlooked by audacity or ambition. The judge leaned forward, scanning each document, then looked directly at Ethan. "These records are compelling," he said, his tone firm but measured. "It is clear that the construction undertaken by the Willow Creek HOA exceeds legal boundaries and infringes upon the rightful ownership of Mr. Miller." A wave of relief began to swell inside Ethan, a feeling so intense it pressed against his chest. The judge's ruling was decisive. The immediate cessation of all construction and the mandated removal of the cabins built illegally. Every line of the legal documents Ethan had unearthed, every hour of effort he had invested had culminated in this moment. Justice had not arrived by chance, nor had it been gifted. It had been earned through meticulous effort, resilience, and an unwavering belief in his rights. Walking back across his land after the hearing, Ethan felt the sunlight break through the canopy, dancing across the leaves and the creek, untouched and pure. Each step was a reminder of what had been preserved and what had been restored. The forest smelled of fresh possibility, and the air was vibrant with the quiet power of reclaimed peace. This victory extended beyond the physical boundaries of his property. It was a signal to Willow Creek, to the community, that fairness could prevail, that standing firm in the face of audacity could inspire others to protect what was theirs. Ethan paused by the old creek, running his hand over the smooth stones, feeling the weight of the past weeks lifting. His fight had been about more than cabins, roads, or HOA regulations. It had been a testament to perseverance, to defending what is just and true. Hope, once fragile, had been nurtured into triumph, and in that triumph, Ethan found inspiration not just for himself, but for anyone who had ever felt powerless in the face of injustice. The land, the memories, and the legacy of his family were safe once more, and with them a renewed sense of purpose.